welcome to the 8th Berwick Literary Festival. It's marvellous to have you all here. Well, not quite all here, but on the ether, as it were. And a great welcome as well to our speaker in a moment. I should just introduce myself. My name's Stephen Platten. I live in Berwick. I suppose I'm dressed up like this because I'm a bishop. I'm speaking to another bishop, so it wouldn't be valid without that, of course. Anyway, welcome to all of you again, and I think you all know probably how your own microphone and camera works, so you get good reception. There will be an opportunity for questions. We do hope you will ask questions. That's part of the fun of this sort of thing. It's an opportunity to ask our speaker something more about the particular subject as it comes to you, as it were. And you could do that via the question answer facility on your computer or iPad. So please do be ready to answer questions, and we'll come to those later on. So let me first of all introduce Barry Morgan, who we've known each other for a very long time, even when we were having to deal with recalcitrant students training for the ministry. Barry has had a most interesting life and ministry. A good Welshman from the south of the country at Neath. He then made the dangerous move of coming over to this country for a part of his education at University College London, and then later on at Westcott House and Selwyn College in Cambridge. But he's also had a lot to do with the universities in Wales too. Indeed, he's a pro-chancellor, I think, of the University of Wales still. He went on to do parish work, first of all as a curate, and then as a lecturer at St Michael's College in Llandaff in Cardiff, and then on to Bangor University, looking after the Divinity Hostel there, where there was both some teaching, I think, of theology, but also where students stayed, particularly those studying at Bangor University, where Barry also was a lecturer at one point. And he then went on to become the rector of Wrexham and looking after people training for the ministry in that diocese in St Asaph. Before he became Bishop of Bangor, you can see he was much drawn to Bangor, and thereafter to Llandaff in Cardiff, and later he was elected amongst the bishops in the Church in Wales to be the Archbishop of Wales, and that brought him into an even wider world. Of course, he was a member of the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches and had much to do with the organs of international Anglicanism. So we're very lucky indeed to have Barry here, and indeed talking about someone, I think, whose funeral he conducted and who he got to know really quite well before that, of course. So Barry, huge welcome. Lovely to see you here in Berwick and in the ether. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's very kind of you. Now I'm going to talk about the poetry of R.S. Thomas, because he's one of Wales's most distinguished poets, a priest of the Church in Wales who spent all his life in the parochial ministry. And you talking about Bangor has reminded me that he was a North Walian, and although he trained for the ministry in Cardiff, he didn't have much time for the South. Indeed, when I was translated from Bangor to Llandaff, he wrote me a letter saying, "I commiserate with you on your demotion." He died in September 2000 at the age of 87, and his poetry has been translated into many languages, and he's won many prizes, the Queen's Medal for Poetry, for example, and he narrowly missed out on the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1996, which was won by Seamus Heaney. Now, a great number of his poems are about God and the Christian faith, and the title of some of his volumes reveal this attempt to grapple with existential questions, experimenting with an Amen, Mass for Hard Times, The Bread of Truth, Pieter, and so on. And in the poems in these volumes, and indeed in other volumes without religious titles, He grapples with the meaning of existence, belief in God, prayer, and God's revelation of himself in the person of Jesus. And he returns to these themes again and again, and therefore raises fundamental questions about what it means to believe in God and to lead a Christian life. And for that reason, I think he's first and foremost, a religious poet. He doesn't profess to give definitive answers, but he raises questions about faith and belief. And he's able to do that, of course, because he is a poet and not a systematic theologian. And a poet tells the truth, but tells it slant, as Emily Dickinson, another poet, once put it. And because of that, and because in his introduction to the Penguin Book of Religious Verse, he defines religion as the response of the whole person to reality, and poetry as the imaginative presentation of it, he may have much to teach those of us who are prepared to live with questions and uncertainties, because poetry, says Thomas, is that which arrives at the intellect by way of the heart. And he admits in his autobiography, written in the third person, that he turned in later life increasingly to the question of the soul, the nature and existence of God, and the problem of time. And writing about himself in the third person, he says, the religious vein in his poetry became more visible during his last years. After all, he says, there is nothing more important than the relationship between a person and God. Well, how then might the poetry of this poet help us? His poetry arose from and was shaped by his priesthood, but nevertheless, he didn't shirk any of the hard questions that believing in God entails. And his poetry bears marks of his inner wrestling with God as he strives to make sense of God's purposes in the universe. Indeed, he compares writing poetry with the attempt to encounter God. At times, it seems to happen without great effort. At other times, it takes a great deal of effort. The meaning is in the waiting, as he puts it in one of his poems. Now, he raises questions, gives hints of possible answers, but there are no certainties, for he sees the difficulties that believing in God entails, and that to him is the nature of faith. It doesn't have definitive answers, and it doesn't resolve every doubt. And in this talk, I just want to examine how Thomas's poetry can perhaps help us to think about God, about prayer, and about his revelation in Jesus Christ. First of all, his insights about God. He asks, who is it who ever saw God? Who ever heard him speak? We have to live virtually the whole of our lives in the presence of an invisible and mute God. And Thomas confronts head-on the elusiveness and the seeming absence of God at a time when many people seem to know only too clearly how God thinks, what God thinks, and how we should conform to his will. He reminds us that it's impossible to define God. So he writes about the hiddenness of God, the mystery of God, the silence of God, the darkness of God. And people forget that in doing that, he's being true to traditions, centuries of Christian tradition, which has always maintained that God is ultimately unknowable as he is in himself, a mystery to which our human words only point by analogy. And as he says, only something that can be fully defined can be proved. And so since it's impossible to prove the existence of God in the abstract, God remains a concept, an idea about the way things are. One of his volumes of poetry is entitled H''M, devoted to probing both the existence and the nature of God. Does the apostrophe in the title indicate the omission of the letter I, so that the volume is in fact about God, reflecting the fact that God in the Old Testament was never called by his proper name in order to respect his otherness and ultimately his unknowability? Or is H''M just a kind of reflection on how things might be, a kind of Well, Thomas is convinced of the fact of God's existence, but he reminds us constantly that God isn't an object to be explored, but a mystery in whose presence one can ultimately only rest in faith and hope and prayerful existence. For him, God is beyond anything we can conceive or understand. And so it is only through using images, metaphors, that one can begin to find a language for him. And these elements are always provisional, they're always inadequate and always incomplete. And one often has to resort to saying what God is not rather than what he is. For as the prophet Isaiah put it, to whom can God be compared? His thoughts are not our thoughts, his ways aren't ours. It's the attempt to define him. That's when the trouble begins, writes the poet. Perhaps we shouldn't attempt it. If a creature can comprehend his creator is no longer a creator, he once said in an interview. Neither modern mathematics nor the wonders of modern science can capture him. My equations fail as my words do. Genes and molecules have no more power to call him up than the incense of the Hebrews. Thomas compares trying to understand God to the way that waves run up the shore, always to fall back. And the poet, like the tidal wave, runs up the approaches of God and falls back again. God is awesome, therefore, and beyond our reach, and beyond the capacity of our intellects to understand him. And the only possible response is to be silent before God's silent presence. Whose silence so eloquent as this, he asks in another poem. And he picks up this theme of the silence of God again and again. But the silence in the mind is when we live best within listening distance of the silence we call God. This is the deep calling to deep of the psalm writer, the bottomless ocean we launch the armada of our thoughts on, never arriving. Or he says, I dwelt in a soundless darkness in the shadow of your regard. And it is through silence that God communicates, and it's in the silence that humans can encounter him. But a relationship, it can be forged. The relation between us was silence, he writes, that and the feeling of each one being watched by the other. That's true faith. And this reality surpasses the poet's understanding, for he realizes that he can never understand inner nature and being. But this is an active, not a passive watching and waiting. It's an alert attention to the presence of God, for the poet makes his return on his knees, he writes. There's no guarantee, of course, that in that silence, God will necessarily respond, or indeed, if he does, what form the response will take. But the desire of the poet for God is a desire of the heart. It's not a desire of the intellect. Knowing God is about having a relationship with him. And again, that's in line with Christian mystical tradition. A medieval mystic writing in the Cloud of Unknowing says that God can't be reached by the intellect and by reason, but through love. And so Thomas speaks about the desire of the heart, the desire to enter into the darkness of God. But it's obvious that you used to spend a great deal of time in church praying in order to pray to God, waiting for God to reveal himself. Moments of great calm before an altar of wood in a stone church in summer, waiting for the God to speak. The air, a staircase for silence. Speech, therefore, he says, isn't the language of prayer, but waiting and desiring God are. But of course, we can't force God to reveal himself. But only as we give time and attention to him may we encounter him. But of course, there are no guarantees. There was no admiring of my restraint, no suggestions even of a recompense for my patience. If he had allowed himself but one word, his name, for instance, spoken ever so obliquely, my own, that for all his majesty acknowledged my existence. The poet reaches out for God, hoping for a reciprocating touch. But you realize, as did the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart, that where understanding and desire end, there is darkness, and there God's radiance begins. So too, the 17th century divine Henry Vaughan speaks of God's dazzling darkness. The darkness, says Thomas, is the deepening shadow of our presence, the silence, a process in the metabolism of the being of love. The miracle is that in persisting with and in the silence, there do come intimations of the presence of God from time to time. There are times, even at the pole, when he too pauses in his withdrawal, so that it is light there all night long. He's such a fast God, always before us and leaving just as we arrive. And he writes, we never catch God at work, but can only say, coming suddenly upon an amendment, that here he has been. Or in another poem, in everyday life, it is the plain facts and natural happenings that conceal God and reveal him to us little by little under the mind's tooling. God, therefore, may say very little, but, says Thomas, he does sometimes speak to us, but one has to pay attention, one has to listen hard to what he might be saying. There is an economy about God's self-revelation. It is when one is not looking that God comes. God, therefore, isn't predictable. You can't pin him down. You can't guarantee to find him in and through the world. But there are moments, if we are alert enough, when that can happen. But what the poet is also saying is that the God who created this world does continue to reveal himself in and through it, and that it's often through the events of everyday life that we can discover God and his will for us. In other words, God isn't abstracted from his world, but is revealed in and through it. And we have to be alert to the presence, which is never an unambiguous presence, since God wants our response to be voluntary, not forced. Encountering God, therefore, is never clear and straightforward. But this God does appear to be absent for much of the time, never knowing anything but an absence. I dare not name him as God. Or I never thought other than that God is that great absence in our lives, the empty silence within, the place where we go seeking, not in hope to arrive or find. And so Thomas, echoing Isaiah and later Luther, saw God as a God who hid himself. But the hiddenness of God doesn't preclude our being able to find him when he chooses to reveal himself. Now, that's totally different from not believing in God, because if there is no God, then there is no possibility of finding him. Whereas for R.S. Thomas, a God who hides himself provides a challenge for us humans to search him out, since the poet believed that nothing of any worth came easily. So the hiddenness of God ought to draw us on like a magnet. And the absence of God does suggest the presence of somebody who has been there, but who has moved on. And frustrating as that might be, it corresponds to the spiritual experience of many Christians who reach out in faith to a God who eludes them, who can never be fully grasped, but who has left tantalizing hints of his existence behind. Faith reaches out then in the darkness and is occasionally rewarded by glimpses of where God has been. And these intimations of the divine are enough to spur the poet on in his quest for God. The luminosity of his shadow is enough to sustain him in his quest. And in his poetry and in his discussions about God, Thomas echoes, as I've said, the experience of both mystics and theologians, that God can't be identified with any aspect of the universe because he is the origin of it all. So he believed that when one is conscious of God's absence, then paradoxically one becomes aware of his presence. So that darkness and absence don't imply nothingness, but rather the mysterious presence of the living God as we reach out to him in faith. Faith is continuing to believe that one can catch tantalizing glimpses of this God who is too fast for us. And therefore, that kind of theology alters one's perspective on prayer, because, as he puts it, it's more of a listening than a talking. It's waiting for God. It's opening oneself out to God and spending time in the presence of God. Prayer is about submitting one's will to God, not attempting to enforce one's own will upon God. There is more to prayer, he says, than reciting verbal formulae in his presence. And the poet, in a radio broadcast, once said that he'd yet to come across a satisfactory book on prayer. And he has no patience with the kind of person who would talk to God as if God was eavesdropping in the doorway, nor with bombarding him with personal requests and petitions, a kind of shopping list of wants. I would have knelt long, wrestling with you, wearing you down. Hear my prayer, Lord, hear my prayer. As though you were deaf, myriads of mortals have kept up their shrill cry, explaining your silence by their unfitness. And then the killer line, it begins to appear this is not what prayer is about. And again, in another poem, he explains how in the past it had begun by my talking all of the time, repeating the worn formula of the churches in the belief that was prayer. Why does silence suggest disapproval? The prattling ceased. I contented myself. I was answering his deafness with dumbness. My tongue lolled, clapper of Odysseus' bell that would never again pound on him. So for the most part for Thomas, God doesn't answer prayer in either a mechanical or an arbitrary way, but reveals himself in personal relationships or in nature. So in one poem called Folktale, the poet almost persuades himself to abandon prayer and its endless petitions, but something deters him. Peering once through my locked fingers, I thought that I detected the movement of a curtain. So the poet perseveres with his prayer life, but it's about nurturing a relationship, not seeking answers to a list of demands. And saints and mystics, of course, have also argued that prayer is not about bombarding God with petitions, but waiting in silence for his revelation of himself. As he says in his poem, Ivan Karamazov, he cannot believe in a God who returns prayers like tickets with the words, not granted, written upon them. I repudiate, says Thomas, such a God as this. So Thomas can write about the natural world as a place, on the one hand, of great beauty, a place where God is revealed. Many creatures reflect you, the flowers, your color, your tide, the precision of your calculations. But one mustn't forget, he says, the cruelty of nature and the way that creatures prey on one another, and the great waste inherent in the evolutionary process, the impersonal, pitiless beauty of nature, as he puts it. And so Thomas says, either God has no part in this cruelty, so that there is another power as great or greater than him, or else God is in some way responsible for this creation. And it's summed up in his autobiography, where he sees the sea at one and the same time as a mirror full of beauty and glory, bearing the reflection of clouds and birds, and yet, under the deceptively innocent surface, thousands of horrors, as if they were the creator's failed experiments. And Darwin, of course, in his Origin of Species, raised the same question about the weakest creatures going to the wall. But Thomas isn't saying that there is no purpose or design behind the world. It's evolved over billions of years by the process of natural selection, where admittedly only the fittest survive. And in so doing, I think, he faces head-on the dilemma that all of us face when we believe in a God who has created the world, where there is much beauty and order, that it seems axiomatic that there is a purpose to it all. And yet we also know that the world is full of disorder, disharmony, cruelty, waste. One can appreciate the beauty of a sunset and yet be thrown by the randomness and destruction of a tsunami or an earthquake. We too, like Thomas, can feel, and in the book I read, God is love, but lifting up my head, I do not find it so. It's the heart of the dilemma of anybody who is a religious believer. How do you reconcile a world where beauty, violence, and cruelty seem to exist side by side? It's an unresolved theological problem for all Christians, I think, but Thomas is willing to face it. Belief in God is never straightforward. And that's why on the day of judgment, Thomas says, he would have a great number of things to say to God, storming at him as Job stormed with the eloquence of the abused heart. And he said that what he tilted against wasn't God, but people's ideas of God, stereotyped notions of God. I'm really, he says, derisive about people's ideas of God. I believe in God. I'm trying to show how people sometimes attempt to pin down this being who's not a being. And a lot of my work is ironic, which possibly some people wouldn't always get. And he chastises the church, of course, for trying to pin God down too neatly. We have over-furnished our faith. They laid this stone trap for him, enticing him with candles, as though he would come like some huge moth out of the darkness to beat there. Why then do I still kneel, striking my prayers on a stone heart? It's in the hope one of them will ignite and yet throw in its illumined walls the shadow of someone greater than I can understand. History showed us, he writes, he was too big to be nailed to the wall of a stone chapel, and yet we still crammed him between the boards of a black book. For Thomas, doubt is part of faith, and the opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty. But what then of his insights about God's revelation in Jesus? Now, it's true to say that Jesus certainly plays a less prominent part in his poetry than God, but nevertheless, he is a Christian poet, and a quarter of his poems in Laboratories of the Spirit are meditations on the cross, and both his volumes, Counterpoint and Mass for Hard Times, deal with Christian themes. He writes of God's love revealed supremely in Jesus, but he never explains how that is so. He kneeled long and saw love in a dark crown of thorns blazing, and a winter tree golden with fruit of a man's body. In and through the crucifixion of Jesus, the love of God shines through. Through that crucified body, one can see something of God's grace. And that's depicted here by golden fruit, gold being the traditional color of divinity. So a tree which might look very dead in winter is in fact full both of golden fruit and blazing thorns. So the poet writes that on the tree of the cross, God's love blazes out in Jesus in spite of his agony. And another poem has the same theme of this new life coming through the cross of Jesus. Not the empty tomb, but the uninhabited cross. Look long enough, and you will see the arms put on leaves, not a crown of thorns, but a crown of flowers, haloing it with a bird singing as though perched on paradise's threshold. So to Thomas, in and through Jesus, God is revealed as a suffering God because of his love for humanity. And there are many poems which stress this theme of God's love being revealed through Jesus, a mystery terrifying enough to be called love. God's love is made manifest supremely in and through the cross, and suffering of Jesus. And listening to the violinist Chrysler and watching him play, he writes, this player who so beautifully suffered for each of us upon his instrument, so it must have been on Calvary, in the fiercer light of the thorn's halo, it was himself that he played.
No, it was his.
In other words, just as the violinist gives totally of himself in playing his instrument, the poet sees on Calvary the total self-giving of God in Jesus and a total identification with humanity. Jesus is love's risen body. So for Thomas then, if people want to know what God is really like, then they have to look at Jesus, because he believed that it was in and through Jesus that God's love was disclosed as fully as it could be disclosed in a human being. And that, of course, is totally in line with Christian orthodoxy. So it's interesting that although it's impossible, as he says in other poems, to fully understand and comprehend God, yet this God isn't some kind of remote, inaccessible, passionless God, unaffected by what happens to his world. In Jesus, God draws near to his world. He suffers with his world, and his nature is that of outflowing love towards that world. And that's how God responds to the evil and tragedy of his world, by being involved in it through Jesus Christ. At one and the same time, God is absolutely different from and beyond his world, and yet in and through Jesus relates to that world in self-giving compassion and love. The action of Jesus is the action of God, and the two things can't be separated. So the life, ministry, and death of Jesus for Thomas lie at the heart of all that, because this God suffers in and with his world and aches with it in its brokenness and its tragic happenings. The poet doesn't explain how or why that's so. He simply states that to be the case. So for Thomas, God isn't some self-contained absolute monad of the Greek philosophers, unaffected by the tribulations of creation, but a suffering, passionate God who aches for the world and embraces it through Jesus with his love. God is revealed in Jesus, and especially in the cross of Jesus. I'm terribly sorry about this, but somebody is hammering on my door and I just have to go and stop this now. Can you just excuse me for a minute? My apologies about that. Somebody wanted to deliver something. Where was I? I was trying to say that that God is revealed through Jesus, and especially through the cross of Jesus. This Christmas, before an altar of gold, the holly will remind us how love bleeds. And it's very difficult, as I said, for anybody to explain how this God of love answers the suffering of his world. Thomas simply says that it is God's nature. Love is his chief attribute. And he's not a theologian in the sense that he works out some kind of systematic theory of atonement or resurrection. But he nevertheless links the cross of Jesus to the love of God, so that you can't really understand God without that link. The cross is a mystery, terrifying enough to be named love. God is impassible, yet darkening your countenance once for a long moment as you looked at yourself on a hilltop in Judea. And here again, Thomas's poetry is akin to the thoughts of many theologians. God looks, in the words of Rowan Williams, into the crucified human face to see who he is, to see himself in the center of the world's suffering. And it was Michael Ramsey, another Archbishop of Canterbury, who described God as Christ-like, and that in him there was no unChrist-likeness at all. And again, no explanation is given of how and why that is so. For them, as for Thomas, it's simply the case that that is so. So Thomas is prepared to live a life of faith with doubts, uncertainties, and paradoxes, but also prepared to admit that I have faltered like Peter, unable to believe you had arms to sustain me. And God is prepared to accept all that because he's not a God who bludgeons us into belief, but gives us sovereign freedom to come to him in our own way. God is elusive because he doesn't want to force his being upon us. His approach is always unobtrusive, even ambiguous. Remarkable, says Thomas, merely for the absence of clamour. And if we are to form a relationship with God, God wishes it to be a voluntary one, to yield to an unfelt pressure that, irresistible in itself, had the character of everything but coercion. That too is characteristic of a God whose nature is primarily one of love and compassion. I want Thomas to have the last word, so I will read a poem entitled The Kingdom, which sums up the nature of God's love and invites us to join him in his work of love and healing for his world. It's a long way off, but inside it, there are quite different things going on. Festivals at which the poor man is king and the consumptive is healed. Mirrors in which the blind look at themselves and love looks at them back. An industry is for mending the bent bones and the minds fractured by life. It's a long way off, but to get there takes no time, and admission is free if you will purge yourself of desire and present yourself with your need only and the simple offering of your faith, green as a leaf. Thank you, with my apologies again for that interruption.
Barry, thank you so much. Don't worry, we're all used to those things. I've had phones ring and various other things go on, but that was there's so many things I'd like to ask, so I'll have to try and be a bit ordered. But just starting where you finished, I know that poem well, but one might say that it was rather uncharacteristic of much else of what Thomas wrote. Is that fair, or?
Well, the thing is, I think, if one is a theologian, one wants a tidy, systematic tidying up of all the loose ends, and everything is coherent and explicable and fairly straightforward. But that's not how, I'm not a poet myself, but I don't think that's how poetry works. And I suppose what he's doing in his poetry is exploring different themes at different times, depending on his moods or his experiences, so that you can't look for a kind of tidying up of everything with all the loose ends tied. Sometimes he says this and sometimes he says something that seems totally contradictory. That's why one of his volumes is called Counterpoint, where you have two things going on at the same time, and there can't be a kind of harmony between them. And that's the beauty of the poet, I think. And that's a frustration as well, of course.
Yes, and it's following that tradition which you hinted at, which is often given a rather sort of technical name of the via negativa, the negative way.
That's
but
right.
That last poem, the one you read, had a slightly greater sense of the affirmative in it, I think.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, having talked about the unknowability of God, there is this paradox that because he's a Christian priest, he then comes back and says, well, actually, you can know God, what God is like, through Jesus Christ. Now, in some ways, that too doesn't kind of add up if you look at it logically. But he's not concerned with logic. He's concerned with matters of the heart and faith and so on. And so he says that if you want to know what God is really like, you've got to look at Jesus.
And I wonder, the other thing that struck me as you were talking is, I wonder how other poets have seen Thomas, because by no means all poets would be believers or Christian or whatever. I suppose another poet who has some similarities in terms of where he's starting from would be Geoffrey Hill. But I wonder if have you any notion how other poets responded to the fact that he was almost, I would always say, obsessed with belief, and that puzzling, as it were. That, yeah.
Yes, it's this constant wrestling with God. I mean, I don't know about other poets, but some writers have suggested that really Thomas was really an atheist, and it would have been much better if he'd admitted as such, because he has so many questions that he ends up not believing very much. I don't think that's being very fair to him. I ministered to him in his old age, and once in hospital, he had a book on time and eternity on the bed covers. And so I said to him, well, tell me a bit about that, and what do you think about death? Are you afraid of death? And he said, I come from God, I go to God. It was good enough for Augustine, it's good enough for me. So there's a kind of paradox there too. And when he came to receive communion, I mean, the devotion was palpable. And he was brought up, of course, in a theological college that was very high Anglican. And, he writes kind of radical stuff in his poetry, but in his worship, he did not like westward celebrations. He always wanted the priest with his back to his people. And he retired just as the church in Wales was embarking upon what he called the desecration of the prayer book. So he retired in the 1960s before even then the new prayer book came in, which is by now very old, of course.
Yes, and of course, in a way, that sort of attitude with facing away from the people to the altar, looking beyond, picks up something of the way he thinks. But what you've just said is interesting, because the first question I have here from someone in the audience is agnosticism the only valid berth for the storm-tossed vessel of religious belief?
Well, one has to live with questions. One cannot know, one has no definitive answers. You can believe in God and believe in the goodness of God without having all the answers at your fingertips. I mean, why is it that if one believes in the grace and the goodness and the compassion of God, there is so much hatred and violence and evil in the world? I have no answer to that. In terms of an explanation, only in Thomas's terms, that in and through Jesus, I believe that that's how God answers it, that he bears it in and through Jesus. Now, that's not an explanation, it's a response, if you like. So one has to live with all of that.
Another question, which sort of comes in slant to that. Helen Wright asks, based on your research, what insight have you gained as to what drove Thomas to write his poetry? Who was his imagined audience?
I think actually he's writing for himself. These are questions that he himself had, and therefore he's writing basically for himself. He's writing with total honesty and raises all kinds of difficult and different questions at different times. And he himself says, as I quoted, that during the latter part of his life, questions about belief became more and more important to him, because he says there is nothing more important than a relationship with God. Now, that doesn't sound to me like an atheist, there is a certain I think the trouble with us is that we tend to think of the Christian faith as having all the answers, with no doubts, with no uncertainties. But faith actually means embracing doubt. One can't have all the answers. One doesn't have all the answers. Otherwise, one would be God.
Now, here's a very different sort of question, but as a Welshman, one you'll find intriguing. Mike Quill asks, what is the connection, if any, between Thomas's mystical apophatic theology and his politics, his radical Welsh nationalism?
Well, I don't know. I mean, he certainly belonged, didn't believe in nuclear weapons. He certainly was fanatically Welsh. And there's a kind of paradox there too, because in the parish of Aberdaron, where he spent the closing years of his ministry, that particular parish depended on tourism for its living. And yet Thomas rails against English tourists and therefore against his parishioners for putting them up and being servile to them. And he even advocated at one time the burning of English homes in his parish. Well, that doesn't square, I don't think, with this God of love either. So he's full of paradoxes in that kind of way, and I don't think one can tie it all up. I mean, he's too complex a man for that.
Well, here's another Welshish sort of question. Thomas was a very proud Welshman, and Wales has a very strong tradition of Methodism, so Stephen Hughes says. Did he have any thoughts on his compatriots' preferred denomination? Did this cause him any conflicts in his faith or his nationalism? And does this express itself in his poetry?
Goodness me, how many questions is that? He once said that, I mean, his longest poem is called The Minister. And if you look at that poem, I mean, it really is a tip at nonconformity. And he talks about farmers treating their ministers like they treat their cattle, and judging how much they're worth. And he also calls Protestantism the adroit castrator of art. He condemns the bareness of chapels without having any kind of religious symbols in them, very bare and unadorned. So I don't think he's a person of his age, really. I mean, I think he probably believed that the church in Wales was the one true church in Wales, and that people ought to return to it, even though he was highly critical of his own church as well. I mean, very critical of cathedrals that had military banners and stuff in them. So, the Anglican Church didn't escape his ire either. But certainly, if you look at The Minister and one or two other poems, you can see that he hasn't got much time, I'm afraid, for nonconformity. Although it was from a Methodist minister that he learned to speak Welsh when he was the vicar of Manavan in the 1950s.
Now, this next question, I shan't even be able to properly tell you what the first sentence is, but I'll do my best, and then I'll read the rest of it. Something like Guich diolch o galon o tudawi. Now, is that anything near where it is? Anyway, it then says a question. Indeed, his poetry explores for himself, you have just said. So how much is faith for him an individualist endeavor? How much pursued, experienced, lived through the Christian community? That's from Sarah Rowland Jones.
Ah, the Dean of St. David's. I recognize the name. Well, the point is that I think that in exploring these questions for himself, he raises issues that are important for any person of faith who thinks deeply about the Christian faith. I mean, he certainly helped me in my Christian life. And I think one theologian says that Thomas's poetry has helped him more than volumes of theology because of his sheer honesty and his willingness to actually ask questions that sometimes people are too frightened to ask about. For example, does God answer prayer, or why does one pray, and that kind of stuff, so I think he writes for himself, but in so doing helps the rest of us mere mortals.
Thank you. I have no idea what those first words were. Were they?
Thank you, I think.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah.
As
far as you could tell.
To work out, Stephen.
I know. Well, yes, exactly. Yes, but anyway, then a rather different question from David Owen asking, where can we find the concept of joy in Thomas's poetry?
Well, in some of the things that he writes about nature, discovering God, the bright field, and the kingdom, and poems like that, which say something about the beauty of God's world. There are lots of poems that aren't gloomy and that don't ask existential questions, but which I think help us to look at God, and gives the church hope as well, because we tend to be very gloomy about the future of the church. And one of his poems, he says, well, look, these very seas are baptized. The parish bears a saint's name. In other words, have a sense of perspective. The Christian faith and God have been around for a long time, and one's just got to hang on to that in moments of darkness.
And I've just had an apology from Sarah Rowland Jones. She says she thought you might be reading the questions too, but she saw me making rather a mess of it. But there we go. And then we have one here from, let me just find it again, Janet Carpenter. And she asks you, there is constant reference to God creating us and the world, but in what way can we understand this?
Well, I don't know. He doesn't explain any more than he explains, why is it that it's in Jesus that we see the love of God supremely. I mean, he just states that is the case. He doesn't explain how that is the case. And in much the same way, he takes the existence of God for granted. He takes the creation for granted. He doesn't explain how that came into being or how God made the world. There's one wonderful poem where Jesus says to God, looking on at the world and the mess that human beings have made of it, let me go there. And that's in one sense to take a very literalist interpretation of the incarnation. What Thomas is really saying is, look, that when you see the face of Jesus Christ, it's really my face.
Let me just be very indulgent now and ask a question myself. About a couple of years ago, I suppose, I read Byron Rogers' biography of Thomas. I think it's called The Man Who Went Out to the West.
That's right.
Yeah. And it did reveal an extraordinary sort of background, both in terms of family life and him as an individual. Now, you knew him, particularly in his old age, but clearly he knew you before when he sent that wonderful letter telling you you've been demoted. Can you say a little bit about him from your own experience of his personality?
Well, some people, found him very dour and uncommunicative and offhand, and he could be. I mean, sometimes in Aberdaron, when tourists came and they spoke to him in English and asked for directions, he pretended he couldn't speak English and answered back in Welsh. On the other hand, you speak to parishioners there of an immensely kind and caring parish priest who would take relatives to visit their relatives in the hospital in Bangor, which was 60 miles away, and waiting until they had been with the patient for some time, and then bringing them home again. And I think he liked to provoke. I mean, he liked to kind of say things for effect. I mean, I once was at a public meeting in Pwllheli, and Pwllheli had a series of lectures every year. 1 year they would be in English, and 1 year they would be in Welsh. Anyway, this particular year, the lecturer was from England, and obviously the lecture was in English. And RS was seated in the front. And after the mayor had introduced the speaker, R.S. Thomas got up and said in Welsh, "Mr. Mayor, in what language is this lecture?" And the mayor very politely said, "Well, Mr. Thomas, you know the tradition, it's in English this year." Said R.S., and he flaunts out to the room for effect. Now, you know, that's the kind of man he was. But sometimes too, he would just love to kind of tease people, to provoke people, just to see how they would react. And you could see the glint in the eye. And sometimes I think some of his poems are like that, really. He's really seeing how far he can push things. And he admits that some of his poems are ironic. He's tilting at people's ideas of God. He has a strong belief in God himself. But nevertheless, in his poetry, he explores what that belief might mean.
But actually, when you were talking to him yourself, he was easy to talk to.
I found him very easy and very easy to talk to. I mean, you know, I'd read his poetry when I was a student, so I was a bit in awe of this man. And I think that after he'd married a second time, that's the paradox of the man again, you know. A Welsh nationalist, he marries two women who can't speak a word of English. His son he calls Gwydion, which is a hard name to pronounce. It's a Welsh name. But he sends him to a public school in Shrewsbury to be educated. So this man is kind of full of paradoxes. But yeah, I think he softened and mellowed in old age, particularly after his marriage to Betty Vernon. And I remember once meeting him outside Woolworths in Bangor, and he was looking at buying Christmas trees. Now, I can't imagine the old R.S. Thomas buying Christmas trees outside Woolworths. And I said to him, "Look, you read your poetry in lots of places. Why not come to the cathedral and read your poetry?" "Oh," he said, "I'm far too old for that." And Betty said, "Leave him to me, he'll be there." And he came one evening and the cathedral was absolutely packed. And he just kind of held them spellbound. Although actually, he read his own poetry in a very deadpan kind of voice. But you know, it's amazing.
Now I've got two more questions, and if you could give me a relatively brief answer, we'll get them both in. Colin Wakelin says, did he ever reconcile his faith with developments in society, sometimes called progress?
Well, I mean, he certainly kept up his reading. If you read some of his poetry, you know, he certainly knew all about scientific advances and tried to link that up with his Christian faith. And some of his poems try and do that, in fact.
The last question is from Michael Wright. He says, I don't know R.S. Thomas's work, but he sounds unpleasant and anti-English. Comments, please.
Well, it wasn't unpleasant. There are times when you could say that he was anti-English. Yes.
And yet he himself had some education in England, hadn't he?
No, he was educated.
No,
he was born actually. He was born in Cardiff, brought up in Holyhead, read classics at the University College Bangor, as it was then called, came to St Michael's Llandaf, and then spent all his ministry in North Wales, in the diocese of St Asaph and Bangor.
Oh, so it was just the way he educated his son was the anomaly.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And you used to converse with him in Welsh?
Yes, I used to convert with him in Welsh. And again, there's a kind of love-hate relationship with his mother, because his mother spoke Welsh, but he was furious with her for not having taught him the language. And he didn't learn the language until he was 30. And he wishes that he could have written poetry in Welsh, but he couldn't.
Well, we better stop, I think, because otherwise I'm going to run into the clock, as it were. But thank you so much, Barry. I mean, we've had heaps of questions there, and I had to get those last two packed in. So I do hope people will go away and read more R.S. Thomas. And I think the Byron Rogers book is quite interesting.
Yes, it is. Yes,
gives you background. Yeah. So thank you so much. And thank you too to the audience. A very participative, yes, I can't even speak English now. Participative, yes, anyway, you know what I mean. you've all been participating, and please, do let the social media know how excellent this has been, because it's recorded, and Barry's happy, I'm sure, that other people should hear about it. And if you happen to be able to give a donation, that's helpful, because although this is free, running a literary festival is not without cost. So that would be great. More events coming up. We've got Simon Armitage, Gordon Brown, others. And don't forget, next year, starting on October the 22nd, is the 9th Berwick Literary Festival. Thank you all once again. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you.